And speaking of headliners in a big way, Bruce Cockburn.
Bruce Cockburn.
It's funny because on this album, he's probably the 6 of 6 in terms of name recognition. So, Matt, why don't you run the numbers? And actually, you're the first guy to speak on this, followed by me and then Josh.
Yeah, so much so that Josh and I didn't know that it wasn't pronounced Cockburn. So I gotta say,
I did for reference.
John did. That's good. So I had never heard of this guy. So I'm almost like looking at this, going, man, if that's how you pronounce the name, I would change the spelling. I would go to I go down to the records office and be like, all right, I gotta change this because that's just unfortunate. But anyway,
why, Matt? Why would you change it? What's offensive about it?
I'm gonna let the listeners make their own deduction on that.
What's the etymology on this last name? I want to know the history. It's probably like Welsh or something.
Well, he is Canadian, so Welsh sounds like
is that
a good
Canadian
guess.
thing to where the CK is silent?
Well, I'm saying like Josh said Welsh, and I said, well, good guess, but it would be Welsh by way of Canada. So yeah.
Well, anyway, Bruce Cockburn's Humans from 1980 comes in at number 1,291 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 146 in 1980, number 8,641 of all time. It is not on Rolling Stone's list, and it's Bruce Cockburn's third highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind 1979's Dancing in the Dragon's Jaws and 1984's Stealing Fire. So, this has got to be 1001 album I need to hear before I die. Okay.
It is.
I disagree with that. I don't think this was an album I needed to hear before I died. I was not a fan of this record.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This was easily the weakest album of the week for me. This sounded like it did sound a little bit ahead of its time in terms of, this sounded like in parts like a 90s coffee house kind of, sound. It's like got a very crisp production, kind of a little bit of a jazzy thing going on. But I was kind of picturing some early 90s, kind of coffee house type stuff.
I did not get that vibe, to be honest.
I did.
Yeah,
I did.
I got my comparison was Ben Folds. He reminds me of Ben Folds.
Mm.
So.
Without the piano, I mean, the piano, Ben Folds is much
I guess more of the
piano.
vocal delivery.
Okay, maybe that.
That's not a bad approximation, Josh.
Yeah, this just didn't do much for me at all. I didn't think that the production, first of all, was a hard thing for me to get into. It's very, there's zero edge. This is another one of those zero edge. It's got a little bit more edge than Steely Dan, right? Okay, I'll give him that. But
he's writing about some more topical things than Steely Dan.
So, and that's the other thing too. So this was an album, and I did just a tiny bit of research, so I know that the lyrics on this album are kind of one of the more one of the features that stands out a little bit more.
You don't say.
A little bit more. But I gotta say, I don't know, man. It seemed heavy-handed. It seemed a little too wordy. It seemed a little too preachy. This was one of those things that I'm kind of listening to it going, I don't like the lyrics to this. They're actually off-putting, when usually I can just put them in the background and not really pay too much attention there. Mm-hmm. And look, good on him for addressing socio-political topics and whatnot. But it seemed too. I felt like I don't know. I felt like on some level I'm like, is he kind of. It just seemed preachy. I think that's the best way to put it. And it just seemed like, all right, I get it. And there was a bunch of tracks on it. I mean, there's a good. I don't know how many tracks are on this record, but there are
10.
There are 10. It seemed longer than that. This was an album that seemed a little bit longer. Some parts where it wasn't all bad. I mean, there were some parts on here that I was like, okay, that was kind of interesting. I mean, he mixes stuff up throughout the record in some of the songs, and there's some parts that are okay, but it just at the end of the day, I was like, I listened to all of these albums several times. I got through this one twice, and I was like, I'm good, and I don't want to go back to this. So I am a thumbs down on Bruce Cockburn. It just wasn't my cup of tea.
You know what's interesting about this album? I knew Matt would be a thumbs down on this album because this is definitely the lyrics and the lyrical content. Because Bruce Cockburn, it was very because I didn't know much about his bio, and in listening to this, I said, well, this guy has to have a background in folk music, even though it doesn't sound like true folk. And sure enough, he had a background in folk music, and this was his view of folk music merged with the 80s, which is exactly what I sounded like. Then I said, Well, this guy, it feels like he's at a point in his life where he's weighing existential questions, because this has all the feel of a searcher, like deep, and sure enough, like this was after his marriage broke up and he went and lived in this poor part of Canada, you know what I mean? And just kind of observed life. I said, well, yeah, for sure. These are things. And then the number 3 thing I said was, this is an interesting album to listen to in 2022, because it's like if I took all of my most sort of dimmest views of humanity, I think not in like a plague and pestilence and violence way, but more in like human tendencies, this would be like what it would sound like if I sort of wrote like a bleak view of humanity, kind of, because that's sort of what I felt the lyrical content was. Interestingly enough, Matt, there was something about this guy's point of view that reminded me of you for some reason. I don't know why.
Wow.
But I knew you would hate this album, but somehow this also reminded me of you a little bit. Like, I don't know why, and I can't quite
don't either, because I don't feel like
I feel like this maybe your like shadow self, kind of, like, in that this is sort of the world you try to block out a little bit, but this is, if you let yourself into that, it would be what it would be like, right? But you just kind of don't. So instead of writing Grim Travelers and Fascist Architecture, you're like, I really settle in on the music. And I'm like, this would be like if Matt listened to the lyrics and processed it, it would be like, oh. But like, there's just, I don't know why. That's what I got. I could be completely incorrect.
I don't see that at all. But
I feel like this is like, he's kind of the door that you don't allow yourself to go down to, but it might be a little bit like this. I don't know. I could be crazy. Josh could tell me I'm crazy on that one too. But there were glimmers of I didn't necessarily like this album musically, but I think I've gone into, for those that might be listening for the first time or haven't heard me go through the journey of the 60s and 70s, I'm not a huge folk music guy, and I'm not a huge what I call word volume lyric guy, where just you're getting lots of words and it's sort of almost spoken wordy and it's stringing together.
Yep.
This one did, though, have grasps of time where I connected with it, and I think it's because very few people write this barely. Like this, it's very vulnerable, the music, and it's very pessimistic, kind of.
It's kind of Leonard Cohen-esque.
It is. It's to combine the two that you use, Josh, I actually think it makes it's like Leonard Cohen meets Ben Folds. It really, that's actually a great comparison. But he lays it stark, and I admire the fact that he lays it stark, and I admire the fact that this is a guy who's just not firing off lyrics. This is a guy that you almost can tell the stage of his life he's at, like a Leonard Cohen. And much like a Leonard Cohen, where the music does very little to me and actually can somehow hinder my enjoyment of it. And in Leonard Cohen's case, you throw in his vocal sound as well as stuff. That was not a problem for Bruce Cockburn. He's a perfectly fine singer. So once again, this one's another right in the middle for me, because songs like Tokyo and Fascist Architecture and You Get Bigger As You Go kind of hooked me a little bit into the lyrics, but to transcend into like a thumbs up, I need it more lyrically, and this was sort of a warmed over 80s production / small elements of tech built into it, mixed with pretty standard issue folk musicianships. My guess going into this was that Matt was going to dislike this album and Josh was going to like it. Josh, did I get it right or did I get it wrong?
Yeah, I kind of like this album.
Yeah.
And it's not because of the lyrical content, actually. It's because of the music. For some reason, I kind of really liked he seemed to blend genres a bit there. He is in some interesting ways, in some ways it didn't work for me. But I really like his use of violin throughout this album. I thought it was effective and kind of reminds me of a little bluegrassy maybe, or sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's happy. I think it's in Grim Travelers and You Get Bigger As You Go are examples, and How I Spent My Fall Vacation. All times he uses violin effectively for me. He seems to want to incorporate some sort of like easy, jazzy island beat, almost reggae beats at times.
Absolutely, there's a reggae feel. Yep.
And Rumors of Glory and What About the Bond? I heard that. When he includes synth in it, I didn't like that. Like More Not More. There's some synth at the end or in the chorus that kind of takes me out of it in a way and kind of makes it feel a little dated to me. For some reason, the way he uses synth did not work for me.
Well, it's kind of funny because I think at the time the synth was supposed to make it sound like the future, but now when we listen to it, it makes it sound like the past.
Yeah. So I really like all of kind of the musical melodies and choices he makes coupled with his voice. That's really what stood out to me and what I enjoyed. I mean, I could tell he was singing about political things and kind of heavier topics, but I kind of pushed that to the background when I was listening to it. Not necessarily intentionally. It just kind of wasn't what I was interested in hearing. So yeah, there's some, and I think there's some standout tracks on here for me. I think Grim Travelers is really good. I think Rumors of Glories is really good, and maybe like something like Tokyo, which is kind of a more sparse sounding song. I think that's interesting as well. So, you know, I'm in the middle, trending up, I guess, on this one versus the Diana Ross album. I think there's something here. Am I interested enough in him to go find his other albums? No, probably not. Not unless they're part of the show. But I thought it was interesting, considering I didn't know this artist, and this is not even his highest rated album. So at least according to Best Ever albums. So yeah, that was interesting.
Lyrically, this is kind of like, you know, the take is sort of, we're destroying the environment. What does that say about us? Mm-hmm. You know, we're getting older, and how do we deal with that? You know, we're cruel to each other. What does it say? You know, it's a very timely. Existential. Well, it's a very existential album. Like, you can tell it's a guy wrestling with the big questions and almost being a little bit, at times sad, at times depressed, at times angry, at times apathetic. You know what I mean? Like, he's processing it through all the lenses, which I think that's what I connected with. It's, you know, I'm at a little bit of an existential stage in my thinking right now, especially in the post-COVID world, and so I could relate quite a bit to doing just thematically, I could relate to kind of what he was going for in this. So for me, like Josh, the parts where it was more reggae definitely was a plus for me, and the parts where it was more synth, as Josh said, and even for me, some of the violin stuff was where it was a little less effective for me. But the lyrics, which didn't seem to process for Josh, which is unusual, but that's okay. I could think he was going in a different direction. I know for Matt are not a huge piece of the equation. The lyrics were kind of what my appetizer was on this, and kept me hooked.
I think as a counterpoint to Leonard Cohen, like, his music is kind of light and positive, and that kind of balances out some of the heaviness of his lyrics and existential stuff, versus Leonard Cohen sometimes is like,
yeah, there's no Jew's harp.
Much.
Right? Is that what it was called, right? Jew's harp? The thing that he used?
Just everything was the not just the vocals, but the melancholy of the music, of the tone.
God, and you didn't even listen to that album from the early 70s I listened to, which was
Songs
just
of
like
Love and Hate.
Oh, it was as close to the act of committing suicide as I've ever gotten. I mean, literally, there's a song where he's like walking you through it. I'm like, oh, this is not a great place. And I listened to that like right in the middle of quarantine, so that was not a good I was like, who wants to go to this headspace? But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
This is interesting. I mean, there's this. I'm fine with folk music. I like lots of folk music. This is just, I don't know. Maybe it was the 80s production. I love Bob Dylan. Yeah, but I just think that there was maybe it was just part of the production, the timing of it. It really didn't resonate with me. There was, like I said, there's parts like Tokyo. You both brought that up. That wasn't bad. I liked elements of that, and I liked I did notice the reggae. I don't know what songs offhand, but I do remember hearing there's a little bit of reggae here. So yeah, it's just I just can't. I don't know. I'm good. Yeah, I think.
Okay, fair enough. And sometimes it hits you at a certain spot, you know, and I think that maybe that's what it is. Maybe all three of us got hit at a different spot of where we're at in our life, and if we did this 2 months ago or 2 months later, it might hit us differently.
No, but that's a good point.
I got the feeling that that's how we all took this one, which is interesting because I feel like he was writing from a spot too. So it's kind of interesting that we would all take it from a spot as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.